Alright, so the struggling against Twisting Blade Rogues is very strong. Not that there's anything wrong with that build, but there's little to no fun when it comes to character building if everyone is just running the very same single build, simple build. And no, there's nothing simple about Twisting Blades, but then again, everyone is running that build and maybe you want to do something different that is competitive, that is going to allow you to play through the endgame. I already have this build explanation on the leveling and it levels just beautifully amazing. Again, this is not going to be as strong as Twisting Blades because for something, it is a meta thing, but then this is something that is going to be efficient, that is only going to allow you to play throughout the entirety of the endgame. And this build, it's a rapid fire build that is going to allow you to clear dungeons that are 10 levels above you on Nightmare difficulty and in the endgame difficulty and whatnot, as you are seeing on the screen right now, where we are fighting enemies 10 levels above us. And we're doing so at a fairly good speed. And also do have in mind that where this thing is going to excel and where this thing is actually going to be better, not that it matters that much, is going to be on elites hunting and boss fights. Again, you're not going to be doing that much boss fights because of the Nightmare dungeons, they are randomized, and there's some things that you're hardly ever going to be facing against boss fights. But then again, if that's something that interests you, this is going to be better against boss fights than the Twisting Blades build, which focuses, as you should, on AoE damage to clear things faster. The AoE damage of this thing is not that bad, but it's never going to be as strong as a Twisting Blades build. Nevertheless, as you're able to see, it's very efficient, it's something very fun that you can use, it's something very cool that you can play throughout the entirety, like I mentioned before on the endgame build. Little things that you need to have in mind, what this thing is going to be focused on, and some things that you actually do want to avoid because there are some things that you do not want to play against on your grinding for your level 100. So the very first thing that you do not want to do is enter Nightmare dungeons that are going to have the debuff of making you lose your primary resource. This build relies heavily on your primary resource. As a matter of fact, if you run out of your primary resource, you're going to be left with your cheeks wide open for the enemies to enter in there and possess you like no one has ever seen before in any kind of possession or Diablo game or anything like that. Anyways, you never want to be without energy, so that is why you're never going to be entering dungeons that have the debuff to make you cause enemies that make you lose energy when enemies hit you. So that is the main thing that you do want to avoid. Second, the means of damage that this is going to do, again, relies heavily on energy. You're always going to have your energy at 100%, and that is going to be the determining factor of our legendary aspects that we are going to be using. The bad thing about this build is that it heavily relies on legendary aspects that you can only extract from items and not from the codex, so that is a bummer as well. But once you manage to get them, at the end of the day, at the end game, you should be fighting to get those endgame legendary aspects that you can extract from items because they are the most powerful things in the world in the game right now. So that is something that you should be striving to get. And then finally, it is going to be a very heavily reliant build on vulnerable enemies, so that is something to have in mind as well. Now that being said, let's run through the skill tree. This is the skill tree that I have right here for you. Feel free to take a picture right here. I'm not going to explain every single little thing in here for you. As a matter of fact, we're going to be doing that on the rotations, and I'm on the rotation section of the video, which you can find down there on the timestamps that I have for you. You can check what is this thing going to do. But for now, I do not want to explain every single little detail to you because I value your time, and I do not want to waste your time just looking at this screen right here. We're just going to make some little brief recommendations in here, things that you can change if you so wanted to. But then again, if you want to as well, feel free to pause the video right here, and if you're going to be using this build, take a picture right here and take a picture right here. And then again, on the rotation section of the video, I am going to explain you the reasoning as to why do we have this little thing. That being said, changes that you can make to this build. We're always going to have our enemies vulnerable. This thing, you're never going to use your basic skills. You're always, 100% of the time, or always going to be using rapid fire. Unfortunately, that relies on your rotations. Your rotations is going to be these two guys. Again, we're going to be speaking about later on the rotation section. And then if these guys are on cooldown, which they will very often be, this is your second rotation that you're going to have the imbuements. And if that fails, the only means of damage that you're going to have left is your basic attack, making enemies vulnerable. Always, 100% of the time, you always want to be attacking enemies that are vulnerable, because you're going to be losing quite a lot of damage if you do not do so, and you're also going to be losing quite a lot of energy. And if you lose your energy, you lose your damage, you lose your heals, and basically you're pretty much dead. Alright? So you can change this guy for Forceful Arrow. Forceful Arrow is going to be the very same thing. It's just going to take longer to make enemies vulnerable, and it's going to be from a distance. This guy relies on being close to the enemy to make them vulnerable, but it's that much faster because it's just one cast of this thing, so that is why I like to use this thing. And then you could swap the vulnerability, the synergy that you have between these guys. One important aspect of making enemies vulnerable is that you're going to be using this thing, and then this thing, you're going to cast Concealment. After you cast Concealment, you're going to be casting Poison Trap, and then everything around you is going to be vulnerable, which means that it's going to be a bloodfest for you to kill enemies that are vulnerable. There are many people that are changing that for Rain of Arrows, because Rain of Arrows basically deals damage on a whole array of area, and it's going to make every single enemy vulnerable. But it has a 60 seconds cooldown, whereas this guy has 10 seconds cooldown, although you are going to be entitled to wait for the concealment. And this guy is going to, the rotation of this guy is going to allow you to use your Shadow Imbuement. So at the end of the day, by using Poison Trap, you're always going to have more vulnerable enemies. That is basically the changes that you could do to the build. And again, we're going to be speaking about rotations on the rotation section of the video. Let's talk about some of the legendary aspects that you want to have a must for the build. Alright, so there's a huge amount of legendary aspects that you can use, but these are the ones that I consider the must-have aspects that you want to have in this build. The rest of them you can play around with whatever you feel the best is your interest for you, but this one, for example, the accelerating aspect. Then again, this is an aspect that you are going to be extracting from something. You cannot get this from the codex. Basically, this thing, what it does is critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 15 or 25% for 5 seconds, although this one is going to receive a buff of 100%, so it could potentially be 50% if you get a perfect roll and you place this thing on your main two-handed bow or crossbow, which you should be using either a bow or a crossbow. And this is where you're going to place this thing. What this thing is going to do, it's that it's going to basically double your damage. Yes, you heard me right, it's going to double your damage, because the only thing that it needs to do this thing is proc a critical strike. Your core skill has a native amount of critical damage being increased for each arrow you're firing. So I do not remember the specific number, but the first arrow is going to have 5%, the second 10, the third 15, all the way to that extra critical thing. So even if you do not have high intelligence, when you're spamming your rapid fire, this thing, it's, trust me, going to be always 100% of the time active, and this is what makes enemies to basically be lasered by this build. So this is a must, this is something that you have to do, yes or yes, you have to have it. And then we have the aspect of inner calm. Since most of the times, most of the cases, we are only going to be moving to reposition ourselves when we are in a tough spot, but basically you're always going to be standing in one single place. That means that this guy is going to raise your damage up to a 30%, which is huge. It's amazing every time that you're standing still, and you are going to be standing still. Then we have the Edge Masters aspect that we're going to be placing in our amulet, which is going to have a 50% increased little thing. And so basically skills deal that much percentage of damage based on your primary available resource when you cast it. And since, do remember that we always have our energy at 100% because we're always attacking vulnerable enemies, we always have the most out of this thing, so it's just basically that much more damage. Aspect of Disobedience. Again, we're going to be standing quite a lot of time. We're going to be standing quite often. So if you deal damage, which you are going to be dealing huge amounts of damage with this thing, it's going to increase your armor, and since rogue it's a little bit squishy, this is going to allow you to survive through most of those scenarios where you are going to be being attacked by the enemy while you're building this thing right here. And then again, this is just going to give you that much health regeneration based on the enemies that are around you, and it's going to be working in synergy with this thing right here. And this is just basically going to save you from CCs from the enemies, and it is very important that you actually do avoid as much CCs from your enemies, because then again, if you lose your damage with this build, if you stop doing damage, then you're basically opening yourself up to be killed. And so yeah, if you make silly mistakes in this build, then again, I want to be very clear. I'm speaking about certain situations where you are going to be running dungeons that are that much more high levels above you. So as you can see me doing during the gameplay, I'm doing just fine, but I am fighting against enemies that are 10 levels above me. Usually the ideal thing, you should be running enemies that are 5 levels above you, and if you're running this build with enemies 5 levels above you, you're going to be leveling just fine. You're not going to be needing all of this crazy stuff. This is just the hardcore things that I am showing you right now to survive in those scenarios and situations where you are going to be fighting against enemies that are 10, 15 levels above you, and if you want to fight in those dungeons. So that is something that you need to have in mind. Finally, let's talk about the Paragon points. So this is my Paragon board right now, and I am not going to specifically discuss pattern redundancy. I do not want to waste your time. I just want to give you the basics and what you should be looking for out in your Paragon builds. So you should be focusing either intelligence or dexterity. We are going to be taking a little bit of strength just to be able, I haven't unlocked this little thing, but as you can see, I'm not too far away for unlocking this little thing, and as a matter of fact, this is something that I do not necessarily need. I just want to tell you that you want to focus on damage, marksman skills, and vulnerable things. So for example, we are going to be taking right here on the attachment board, we are going to be taking the node that makes enemies vulnerable. So all you have to be on the lookout for is, like, for example, I do not think that I can see them right here because they are already attached, but you should always be looking for things that are making enemies vulnerable. So this board right here, it's vulnerable. This is the basic board, and I am basically focusing myself on dealing marksman skill damage and dexterity, increasing my damage a little bit. As you can see, I have my intelligence right here, I have my dexterities right here, and I am always prioritizing marksman skill damage, which my basic core skill is what it is going to be dealing damage. And then the legendary one that you want to have, it's the exploit weakness. As a matter of fact, this is the name of the board right here, exploit weakness. Whenever you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they take 1% increased damage from you for 6 seconds, up to a 15%. So then again, you're always making your enemies vulnerable. Since your enemies are always going to be vulnerable, you should never ever be attacking enemies that are not vulnerable. And as you can see, we also have damage to elites right here, which is fairly nice. And I am also going to be taking this as soon as I can. I am going to make my way in here towards this one, which is going to cause that much more vulnerable damage. And basically what you want to do is focus yourself on as much vulnerable damage. As you can see, vulnerable damage right here, vulnerable damage right here, damage to elites right here, and then intelligence and dexterity for your marksman skills damage. And that is basically what you want to do. This build focuses heavily on dealing vulnerable damage, and I know that I have said vulnerable damage too many times in this video already, but then you know that is why we deal so much damage, because we are always going to attack enemies that are vulnerable. And the reason behind that is that we are killing 2 birds with 1 shot. We're gaining infinite amount of energy, and we're gaining that extra damage to vulnerable enemies. So just make sure that you're always dealing vulnerable before you attack your enemies. So now let's talk about the rotations. Sometimes you will see me a little bit struggling quite a little bit more in here. You are going to be repositioning as much as you possibly can. The main thing that you want to achieve with this build, again, this is for higher difficulties if you're going to be fighting enemies that are 10, 15 levels above you. It is most definitely something that you can do, but there are some little things that you need to have in mind. First and foremost, you want to kill elites as soon as possible. Remember, this build focuses on killing single targets, and if you manage to kill that elite that is being annoying to you, then all the better. Everything else will just die slowly, and then also how you should be doing that is that you are going to be throwing away concealments, and since we have the if you manage to copy the skills that I have, once you throw concealment, you're immediately going to be placing poison trap, but it is not going to be just in a random place. It is going to be in a place that is going to affect the elite enemy that you have in front of you. If you have basic enemies, then by all means just laser them and they are going to die very, very fast. But if you have a elite enemy, you should always be focusing first on elite enemies, and they are going to die very, very, very fast. And if they are clustered around, you're going to be using dash to reposition, to try to look for that window of opportunity, to try to look for that place that you are going to be able to laser individual elite enemies, and you're going to be taking them one by one on a guerrilla warfare kind of little thing. And that is going to be your basic rotation. You're going to place concealments. Concealment is going to be triggering trap, poison trap based on the skill board that we have. It's always going to make enemies vulnerable, and it's not only going to make enemies vulnerable just on the time that it activates. As a matter of fact, the poison that is always going to be lingering there in the battlefield, it's always going to make enemies vulnerable whenever they step on it. Now, if you didn't manage to kill the enemies in there, or if you kill them too fast, which is something that will very often happen with this build, you kill the enemies too fast, and then when you move to the next bunch of enemies, you are not going to have your cooldown active yet, which means that then you have to use your Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike, it's always going to trigger on the enemies, because if you're even with physical resistant enemies, because you are going to spam the Shadow Strike against that single enemy, and it is going to kill the enemy. That is also going to make the enemies explode, and when the enemies explode, they make enemies vulnerable around you. So that means that as soon as you see everything vulnerable around you from Shadow Strike again, you can start spamming your Rapid Strike back again once more. And also, you at this point you have your half of the cooldown for your trap, poison trap. It's going to be 10. So meaning you can use 2 poison traps before you can use concealment again. So you're going to be using 1 poison trap with 1 concealment and 1 poison trap with 1 Shadow Strike, because 1 poison trap is going to decrease the cooldown of Shadow Strike, meaning that you can have double Shadow Strikes thanks to the vulnerable, thanks to the poison trap. And then finally, if everything fails and you do not have means nor resources to make enemies vulnerable, you always have your puncture basic skill, but then again, that is a last resource. That is just going to ensure that you never attack things that are not vulnerable. And that is basically how the build works. It is very fun. It is not going to be as strong as a Twisting Blades, and as a matter of fact, it requires too much thought, it requires too much perfection, it requires too much legendary aspects, too many legendary aspects that you're going to need to farm them instead of getting them from the Codex, opposite from the Twisting Blades build that can just basically work just fine with Codex legendary aspects. But then again, this is very fun. I have been leveling with this little thing, and I have been having a blast. If you like the content, like and never appreciate it, and also you today, you're gorgeous and beautiful person, you're in the gorgeous and beautiful person, subscribe to the channel, like the video before you close the door, and I'll be seeing you goddamn gorgeous and beautiful people in the next one. Have a beautiful day, and goodbye.